Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lattes on My Mind.
I'm Hannah.
And I'm Felina.
And I'm Wes.
This week we're going to be talking about an agnostic view of Christianity and religion. So grab your lattes and join us for the journey.
Before we get started today, we just wanted to go ahead and put out a little disclaimer that we are having a guest on, and we are going to be respectful of their beliefs and their views. And if it's not what you believe, that's okay. And we just wanted to provide something for everybody.
And it also might not even be what we believe. However, we think it is important to have all sorts of viewpoints on this podcast.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And we want to be respectful of everyone's beliefs. So if this is not your cup of tea kind of episode, skip this one and join us next week. So last week
we had on my granny.
Right. So we thought, why not have someone else on with a little bit different
just
view?
Just to give a different viewpoint, you know?
Because we want to be welcoming to all viewpoints and kind of have the discussion open. I find it helpful.
Right.
To get other people's viewpoints on everything.
It is. It's good to stay informed on what all the views are. Just because you believe something doesn't mean everybody believes it. And
right.
It's good to represent that, you know?
It's good to represent that. So we have Wes here. I think you guys have heard me mention him. This is my husband, Wes.
Hello, everyone. I've been told not to resort back to my old customer service voice.
That's smart. We wanted you to sound like you, not like polite you.
Yeah, that's the fake me.
Yeah, we need the real Wes.
That's why I said use the real Wes voice. Because if you start listening to yourself back in a customer service, because I feel like I started doing that sometimes.
Yeah.
When we first started, and I was like, I don't want to hear that anymore.
It's like, ooh, that's what I sound like to other people.
Right. So we're going to talk about your viewpoints. And just so everyone knows, this is what Wes is currently believing. And we're going to, discuss with him. And I know me and Felina haven't really gone over all of our viewpoints yet.
But we're going to save that for a later date.
Yeah. And next week, we'll probably get back into a little bit more of our usual scheduled programming. We'll probably go back to some conspiracy theories and history. We just kind of wanted to take a sidetrack and explore the religion aspect because we had talked about discussing that. But we want to continue to do it in a way that invites everyone to participate, not just one viewpoint.
Yeah.
So this week, Wes, give us a little bit of your background because you also grew up in a Christian home. What did that look like for you?
Well, I guess I think the biggest thing is, for emphasis, is both my parents are Christian. I was raised Christian. So I started off going to church every Sunday. I was in Awana. We did vacation Bible school off and on, different youth and life groups. I remember kind of having a moment when I was younger and doing the whole giving my life to Christ. And my mom was so happy and she called her mom.
Yeah.
And it was a whole big thing. But there were a few times throughout the thing I was like, did I do it right? So then I repeatedly did it.
Oh, no.
Just because, got to make sure I don't end up in the fiery pits.
I did that, too, growing up. I was so scared of, because we grew up religiously that I didn't do it right. And so I would repeat it, almost every night. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. But for the majority of my life, we were in a mega church. If you're from our town in Kentucky, you probably know the mega church we're talking about, but we were kind of there when it was smaller, and my family as a whole kind of got to see it slowly become commercialized. But a lot of their teachings we still agreed with, but eventually kind of backed away. Me and my siblings ended up joining my aunt, uncle, and cousins at their church that was a lot smaller, but I soon kind of learned they also had a lot more stricter views on things.
A little more, would you say legalistic almost?
Yes.
Okay. Yep.
Which I think almost kind of started the quote unquote downfall of my belief, but not really. I'm not going to blame a church because it's all multiple factors internally. But I started youth group there with one pastor who was amazing, like the example of like the perfect like life coach, like both to guide you on the right way with Christianity and to guide you like just in life in general. He eventually, moved on, which was completely fine, and we got another one. And at first I was like, okay, this guy is great as well. I do like him.
For those who may not have a religious background at all, what are we defining as legalistic? Just to like give like a little definition out there, so that like they kind of know where you went from, like the legalistic background.
A lot of it at the church we first started at was like, while the Bible does say this, like we're also supposed to be open to everybody. No one's perfect.
Right.
Everyone sins in one way or another. Who are you to say like if you do this level of sin, because this person does another level of sin, they're worse than you.
Yeah.
And then like the legalistic standpoint is like more like, okay, everyone needs to look this way and behave this way. Like everyone needs to be in the kind of the same bubble.
Like,
is that kind of what we're?
I would say, yeah. Also, add in like I know of a church that broke off from another church because they felt that contemporary music was a sin, and it was like, no, it has to be, church has to be very much this, and if you add in contemporary music, you're not worshiping.
Right.
I would also kind of define that as
Legalistic.
legalism.
Yeah, I would too.
Oh, and I think one big difference between the churches that really kind of started to open my eyes is one, I felt preached and taught out of love, and the second, I started to notice the teaching started getting taught out of like fear. And they use kind of scare tactics to follow what they believe is right. So kind of like last half of youth group, I was kind of just there because friends were there, and like, what else am I going to do on a Wednesday night? But I remember the sermons kind of slowly feeling like they were getting more and more aggressive and louder and more like fear oriented, which I'm not going to say every single lesson was that way, but it started to become more of a pattern. I was like, well, that's not necessarily what I agree with, but like I do get your point. And everyone comes from a different background, so like he was willing to tell a lot of his story, so I'm kind of like, okay, yeah, I see why you got to where you are right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think that it probably, you were more attuned to, oh, this is a fear tactic more so? Or like, oh, I don't really believe that because I believe this, because you went to the other church first? Like, do you think if you were born just going to that church, you would...
Yeah, I feel like if that's what I was used to, it wouldn't have like it wouldn't have been as noticeable to me. And like years later, like I'm still friends with some of the people who went to that youth group, and they noticed kind of the same thing. But the guy himself, he's a great guy, and he really wants the best for everyone. It was just his teaching was kind of off-putting for me a little bit.
So I think we were talking about that a little bit last week, like how the church can play a part in kind of turning people away instead of the opposite.
Judgment of the church. You know, it's like, I feel like a lot of times, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have anything else to say about it, but like, I feel like a lot of times the church is known to be very judgmental when it's not the church's place to judge. It's God's place to judge.
Yeah.
It's the church's place, in my opinion, to be loving and open and I mean, teach the word, but like, don't judge anybody because you have something else going on, kind of like how you were saying earlier too, Wes. But
eventually, I mean, kind of like that. Like, I think my parents started to feel that same way. Like, a lot of these churches we're going to are kind of like taking on a judgmental standpoint. So like, as a family, going to church regularly kind of stopped being like the norm. But one thing that always really stuck with me is like my mom in particular was like, going to church isn't what makes you a Christian. It's like the practices themselves. And like to this day, even though I don't like claim to be a Christian, like that's what I would still like define Christianity as. Like it's more of your actions and behaviors, not, you know, your willingness to attend this certain event at this certain time.
Mm-hmm.
So like not like a club, kind of like a lifestyle. And I think that we talked about that before is like, okay, you may be following like the rules of Christianity, but you're not like living like it. So that can be what's so discouraging, I think, to people on the outside of the church is like, they're telling me this, but then I see them living in this manner.
Yeah.
Like I think even last week, the example was that your granny had was someone saw someone in pants, a woman in pants instead of like a skirt.
Her mom started going to church later in her life, and it was a legalistic type of church, and they wore skirts and dresses and stuff to church. And you know, my great grandmother was, you know, not raised a Christian from what I understand, and so she's just now starting to go to church. She doesn't, you know all your rules in air quotes type of thing. So she went to the grocery store in pants during the week. Like she was just going to the store to pick something up, and one of the church members saw her there and like made a scene about it in church the next Sunday. So like I think that's kind of what we're talking about. Yeah. That kind of you hear them preaching love, but then you see them like focusing on such a small thing that's not everyone's belief. So we kind of got a little bit of your background, and we're gonna move on to kind of where you are today. So we were gonna discuss deconstruction, which is a big topic right now, I think, a lot in the Christian circles. I don't know if you've encountered it at all, but I have, and I've mostly have listened to, if everyone knows Rhett and Link from Good Mythical Morning, their deconstruction story, and I know that kind of plays a little bit into yours, so I'm going to let you tell that. But essentially, I guess it's when someone grows up believing that something is true their whole life, and they haven't really stopped because you're kind of in it. You're learning things, but it's what you've always known. It's what you've always believed. And then you kind of hit a point where something kind of rattles your faith a little bit, and you're kind of re-questioning everything that you were taught because of something maybe big that happens, or maybe something small that starts, you start this avalanche. Connecting dots in your head. Yeah.
Right. So, and then you arrive at a different conclusion than you originally thought. Is that like an accurate description, would you say, Wes? Or do you want to go further into that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what pretty much happened. I mean, that picks up off where I'd say about 2017, 2018, like I graduated from high school, started becoming kind of more independent, more of an adult, doing my own thing. Eventually I moved out around 2020. So a lot of like my connections to Christianity was from like a family standpoint. Even by that point, like going to church was, not a regular thing, but we were still open and talking about it. But that kind of led to me kind of just questioning and looking at other viewpoints, kind of just questioning myself, like who's to say what's right and wrong, and how can we know what's right and wrong as, humans. But so that kind of all took full force, and, I did do like research way back when. It's something I kind of want to pick back up now, but I'm lazy and busy.
Lazy and busy.
Yeah. But yeah, kind of like you said, I had all of these questions, and they started pulling a thread of how accurate is what I was raised to believe. Because like, I think one of the big things that you hear from Christians is like, oh, the kids go off to college and they get all woke and stuff like that. Well,
no.
My entire degree was focused on following scientific methods, being able to test, prove, well, if you know it, you can't 100% ever prove anything. That's a part of science. But being able to test, retest, have evidence for these things. And I just started to really question, like, how much evidence is there actually really, and finding support for other things elsewhere, which kind of left me a little lost and kind of had me questioning, like, do I believe what I believe? Because what year did we meet?
2020.
2020?
That's why I said it was 2020
Yeah.
because I remember you moving out like right when I had met you. So that's why I was like, I believe it was 2020 when you moved out and started really, really like questioning that. Because I think when we met, you were still kind of, I've been raised this way and this is what I believe or have,
Yeah.
Would you say, like, when you're talking about like the doubt and stuff, did you ever get like discouraged? Because do you feel that Christians, in a way, if you start doubting, they kind of like, well, you shouldn't doubt, or they kind of freak out because you're asking these questions. Did you experience that at all, or were your like people around you more open to you questioning things?
I think it was a very internal process. So not a
okay.
lot of people, like, it kind of just,
Not a lot of people knew
Yeah.
you were doubting.
Imagine Wes keeping things to himself.
I'm shocked.
well, like when I first met you, like, it was, I didn't know what I was, so it was easiest to just say, I'm a Christian because that's what I have been, so why rock the boat? But
And he had a crush, and so he didn't want to,
Don't say that. No, just kidding. I don't even think this is when you really had any thought toward me at that point. We were just kind of coworkers.
it was more like, God, I hate this job. Get me out of here.
Yeah.
But yeah, what you brought up, I just continued to having questions, continuing to pull that thread. And eventually I was like thinking, I don't know if I have enough to like say that I can believe this. And then I feel like that's one side of the coin. And then the second one is everything we talked about earlier, where I was like, the churches are not practicing what they preach or really following what I was raised to believe in general. Like, and I feel like we see that now in generation gaps. Like when, like, I don't know, we've seen videos or like heard conflicts between like kids and parents because, and you've talked about this too, parents spend all the time raising these kids to follow the word of Jesus and act like Jesus. And they do, usually successfully. But then they turn around and see how maybe parents or other people are not doing it. So then there becomes this tension of which view of this Christianity is right and wrong because, they were raised to follow, love one another, love your neighbor, don't, everyone is equal. No sin is, worse than another kind of, and then you turn around and you see like judgment from the other side.
Yeah.
Like,
that.
oh, well, what you're doing is worse, when it's like, but what I'm teaching my children, I've been taught is no sin is greater than the other, but then I'm going to turn around and go judge this person because their sin's worse than mine.
Right.
Kind of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's how my mom was raised. And she kind of took on I know how Jesus was, and I'm just going to do my best to emulate him. In no way I'm going to be that perfect, but
Yeah.
all I can do is try. That's how I ended up being raised and all my siblings being raised.
So after all this, where you were like feeling that the church wasn't living like they were preaching, what kind of happened next in your kind of deconstruction story?
I think I spent a while not caring what I was. A part of what I was able to eventually label myself as, I feel like does kind of embody that idea. But I spent a lot of time just like, it's easier to just not pick one way or another and just, I do me. But eventually I was like, well, I know kind of what at this point don't believe. So what exactly does that mean? And with like a little more looking, I was like, well, I know I'm not atheist because like as much as I'm like I just don't know if there's a God. So what like religion is there for me? But that kind of led me to like looking at different things, classic Google, because that's a reliable source.
It's the best
It is.
Yeah,
source.
but I eventually kind of came upon the definition of what it meant to be agnostic, and reading through it, I was like, oh, that's exactly where I am mentally. And I did write out the definition just in case anyone needs it. But to be agnostic, it's the view or belief that the existence of God or of divine or the supernatural is unknown or unknowable. One of my favorite quotes, though, from, side note, a very not so great man, but if anyone watches Community, Chevy Chase makes a quote in there calling agnostic the lazy man's atheist. And when I heard that, I thought that was hilarious.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's you.
The
That's,
definition of
me.
Wes.
there you go.
But I was like, well, is this where I'm at? And it kind of just stuck with me. Like, I mean, I don't think anyone can say one way or another. Like, that's my belief. Like, I'm not here to preach one way is wrong. Well, I'm not here to preach at all. But I'm not here to say one way is wrong, the other is right. I'm here to say I don't know if we can know
Which one's right?
which
and
one's right, which one's wrong, or if there is a right and wrong.
How lazy.
Yeah.
That's a joke.
Pick a side. Come
Pick a
on.
side.
All of the above.
What else kind of led you there?
Well, this is going to sound really dumb and maybe like discredit a lot of my points. But as you said, eventually I started listening to a podcast called Ear Biscuits by Rhett and Link, who are a comedy duo. But
Very
Shout
valid.
out.
yeah, shout out. But they spent like kind of like you all are doing a few episodes where they talked about their viewpoints and where they came from religiously.
Yeah.
And they brought up how they were evangelistic Christians and they were way more involved in the church than I ever was, and how their path led them to become agnostic, which their path was a lot more of a struggle for them. But what I didn't know was what deconstruction was, and they were able to define it and kind of go through their, like, provide an example for me. And I was like, oh, that's what I've just spent the last few years doing. I didn't know that,
That had a name.
it had a
wasn't just
name, or it
going away
wasn't
from
just,
faith,
internal struggle.
Yeah.
It's actually, I mean, not
It's common. It's common enough to have a
common.
name for
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Which I know, like, it sounds like hearing a comedy duo make like religious content or like, but I promise you it's very like insightful, deep, and they have so much like outside resources they use. They don't seek out to like switch you one way or another. Like, it's so informational that, which Hannah watched it a lot too.
Yeah, I love them. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I think that lots of Christians shy away from this, but like, I enjoy the deconstruction stories. Like, I'm there for it. And I know I haven't shared totally what I believe. But they were in the church, so it's not like they don't have any credibility. They were practically like doing missions, and like that was their thing. They did like Christian comedy. Like, that was their ministry. So they were in the church. They went to, they have a lot of background in it. They're not just like talking out of no experience. Like, that was their experience. Like, if someone asked them, like, did you know Jesus? They say yes. They're like, anyone who says, because a lot of Christians will say, well, then you just didn't really know God, or you weren't a Christian. And I mean, this is all their story, so it's not, anything that necessarily I'm saying, but they're like, if you had asked us then, we knew Jesus, we had a relationship with him. And they're just and Christians are just trying to say to them, well, then you just didn't really know. You didn't know him.
Yeah.
You weren't really a Christian. And that can be like, that's very, it is a complicated subject, and I don't know, even what I believe about it half the time. But I think people try to discount their story because they're like, well, then you really weren't
Then you didn't
a
really
Christian
have a
or believe.
relationship.
So like, they have experience like with the Bible, with Christianity. They said they were, evangelical Christians. So I don't think that just because they're a comedy duo now, that's discrediting them.
If you hear that scratching, it's my cat
Yeah.
trying to get in the room. Just we'll ignore her.
Yeah, after listening to them, like before listening to them, I was able like, okay, I'm kind of in the agnostic boat, so to say, but I was able to kind of realize, oh, deconstruction is what I did. The one thing that I kind of maybe deferred from some things that they said is Rhett classified himself as a hopeful agnostic, which he still kind of was like, I don't think we're able to say one way or another, but I do have a hope that there is something or someone out there. Whereas I don't know if I necessarily have that hope. The one thing that I struggle with is maybe getting a little too internally worked up about some things I see happening just in the world in general, and usually it stems from extreme Christians pushing certain viewpoints, causing certain scenes, churches doing some pretty extravagant things that I feel are harming the world overall. But where I also do find some hope is I think if you actually, practice what the Bible preaches, those aren't necessarily the real Christians. The real Christians are the ones out to seek the bettering of humanity, whether, they follow or whatnot. Like in the job I'm in now, I work for a nonprofit, and a lot of what we do is also providing families with like resources they need for like underprivileged families. And a lot of that is like involved with churches. Like we have a list of churches that we know will help out with food, finances, travel, and all that's super helpful. And usually they're all super loving. But then, there are times I turn on the news and see like, one well-known Christian personality saying some things that really demonizes a certain, maybe group of people. And I'm kind of like, I don't know if that's exactly, what Jesus would have wanted, hearing you say that.
Yeah, and to clarify, I think you said that when you see people actually living out the Bible, I think you meant like people who, you said you don't agree with people actually living out the Bible. I think you meant like they're not actually living out what Jesus taught. Is that what you meant to say?
Yeah, that's a good.
I was a little confused myself.
That's a good clarification. There are a lot of aspects of the Bible I also disagree with, but one thing that I 100% agree with is the way it's portrayed. Jesus lived out his life like, I think that's how everyone should, like, your goal should just be do the best you can. You can't be perfect, but, the goal is to have a positive impact on your fellow humans and just don't be a dick.
Basically.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing is like most people, it doesn't really even have to do with the historical view of Jesus, because most people believe Jesus lived. So I think the real question,
even like atheists will believe that
there's real evidence
there was a Jesus. It's just not necessarily everything that he did.
Right. And obviously, like you said, the way he lived out his life, and that's what I was talking about with Jesus last week, is like he went to the people that were most despised in Israel at that point.
He was with the tax collectors.
Yeah, he was with the prostitutes.
Yeah,
and it's like, okay, he was actually ministering and going out. And I think that's what's so unfortunate about the church, is like we've become so focused on what we think the message that needs to be preached and not
ministering to the church.
To the church,
not to everyone. And it's just minister to the church and judge everyone else is what it feels like in a lot of places.
Music and parties, and then and instead of it being like, okay, these people literally don't have a home, or these people are like starving, like we've really, I think, lost focus on like what that ministry looks like.
Yeah.
As a, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's one thing too that like a part of my deconstruction I had to wrestle with. It was kind of like, is my view changing because of my beliefs or because of my feelings towards some churches and some Christians. Just because,
Right.
like, I don't want to just be like, oh, I don't like these people, so I can't agree with what they say. Which,
Based off of a
yeah,
handful of people. Yeah.
yeah, because I do legitimately think the majority of Christians are good people. Churches, I don't know if I can say. I think it goes back and forth. I'm not going to claim I know because that's not something I've looked into.
It's hard to find a good church out there.
It is. I mean, as I think I've shared before, I was raised in the church. I had a family member who was in my family. You're like, it's like you're a pastor or a nurse. Not actually, but that's basically, how it feels like sometimes. But it's in that sense, growing up, seeing all the politics of the church and how it works and how all that happens behind the scenes. It kind of opens your eyes and I don't want to say puts a bitter taste in your mouth towards church, but in some
Yeah.
instances it does.
You have an insider view.
You have more of a, ooh, that was a little shady,
Because you're seeing what's inside when they're trying to portray something else on the outside. And
yeah, you see how they act when nobody else is around versus
Right.
when, they're up
everyone's
on,
looking
yeah,
on stage.
yeah.
So I think kind of my biggest thing that I find maybe makes me upset with some of these people is the overinflated sense of righteousness. Because I don't feel like that's necessarily how things were portrayed. But Hannah knows this, that my all-time favorite quote, I think best encompasses how I feel now. I'd be surprised to see if anyone knows who this is from, and you can email them because I'm sure they have.
You can email us at lattespodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us on Instagram at lattes on my mind, all one word, all lowercase.
Boop, boop.
But this is from a certain other TV show, and it's someone who says, "Now I realize that there is no righteous path. It is just people trying to do their best in a world where it is far too easy to do your worst."
Ooh, goosebumps.
That's a good one.
I know
that's-
who it is. I'm not allowed to say.
I mean, I don't know. Like, it's
No,
a
you
not
can't
a
say they gotta write it
educational show, so
Felina would know.
it just really hit hard when I heard that. I was like, that's kind of
would
how
I
I'm
know?
walking the path right now.
I really like this quote. I do think that I always hear the argument with Christians and all this, I'm saying this from a Christian background. I, am a Christian up to this point, and I have a lot of issues with the church as well. But one of the things that I feel Christians say a lot is that you can't be good outside of God. So, because most people believe that, we're fallen humans who are naturally evil. And so this quote where it's like, we're all just trying to do our best in a world of darkness and live a good life.
But you can't be good without God.
Mm-hmm. And I disagree with this. Like, I do think people can be good. Like, I think we have a little bit of both in us.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think we have...
We've got the free will.
Yeah.
At least from what I believe, we have free
The angel
will.
and the devil on your shoulder, one may say.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an analogy for it, even though it's kind of a silly one.
I would disagree with that as well, because I have some people in my life who are also not Christians, but would give the shirt off their back. For anybody, for a complete stranger. And
they
it's
act more like Jesus than
some
Christians.
of the Christians that I have encountered, so it's not all, just some, but I think I would disagree with that as well.
Yeah, I think it comes from the Bible verse, and I don't remember who says it, but it's like, why do you call me good? I think it's Jesus. Why do you call me good? No one is good except God. And I actually do think, I'll have to look it up, and I think that's what Christians use for the most part, like, see, no one can be good except God. And I'm like, well, how is that possible? Because there are actual genuinely good things that Christ himself did that other people are doing. So I'm like, how can that not be a good thing? You know what I mean? Even if it's outside of God.
Was Gandhi a Christian?
No.
I don't think so.
Oh. Let's get into that. No, just kidding. All right, well, so as an agnostic, why do you believe there is no evidence for God?
Which is something that I was going to ask you next too. I think a part of it is, especially in Christianity, it's like a faith-based religion. So even if there isn't evidence, you lean into the faith aspect of it.
Right. And there's the morality argument. I think, like, how do we all know what's right and wrong if there's no God? And I'm not saying this is necessarily stuff that I believe, by the way. I know that you're saying, why is there evidence for God? And this is what I've heard Christians say. I've also heard, creation, like there's, how something had to start it. Whether it's the Big Bang, you believe that there's some effect that put things into place. And it's kind of the same thing. Well, then, maybe it was God who was before that. Or because, something wasn't put us in motion. And so there's that aspect. And then there's also the aspect of, what was it? The morality, creation, and I just blanked. I know that there's more. And honestly, like she said, it's a faith-based religion. So lots of times if people get to the point where, like, yes, there's no, like, you can't just be like, there's God. There's not that evidence.
Right. You can't just call him up on the phone.
Right.
Like,
and people a lot take it as a personal, internal faith that God's spoken to them. And it's really hard because it's, we walk by faith, not by sight sort of thing. But, you have a good point. Like, you can't just, like...
There's not a lot of, like, evidence. I mean, some might argue, like, miracles and stuff would be kind of counted as evidence, but it's not necessarily evidence that it's your God, So that's where, again, the faith does play into it, at least.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
It's hard because sometimes there's not a satisfying answer to, if we know something is right and wrong, like there has to be a God. And I'm like, well, then it goes back to what we were saying, like people can do good outside of God.
Yeah.
So is it, I don't know. It's confusing. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts are too, like, the Bible is the word of God, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Written by man, but...
Yes.
So,
this is what we've discussed too. Like, but go ahead.
So there are just a lot of flaws that I see in there where I'm like, that kind of pokes holes in this idea of, like, higher power. But kind of like the first thing, like starting off with, like, Adam and Eve. I mean, we've had conversations about it too. Like, so the world starts off with two people related who have two kids.
Related.
Who are sons.
Yes.
How do we go from there?
How do we go from there? There were more. There had to have been more. And I also have struggled with that too, especially in the instance of, like, the flood. Like, okay, so everybody died except for this one family. Then how did we repopulate the earth?
Right.
It's like, I think
because we know that's a no-go.
Right. Like, that's not happening.
I know this is a more touchy subject, and I'm not going to, like, try to swing people one way or another, but, like, to me, there's a lot more evidence for evolution in, like, how we got to where we are as humans in the human population. But one thing I do, and I actually think is pretty cool, is there are a lot of Christians who, like, are able to incorporate evolution into what they believe. Like, they can, like, have that faith and understands, like, the science behind it. Yeah. Which is, like, one point, I feel like that's what I was trying to do, but then kept swimming a little further, maybe.
Yeah, you were like, well, maybe this is a possibility to, like, reconcile it with my faith, which I think a lot of Christians have come to this conclusion because they've seen the scientific evidence that's presented to us today. And I was reading about this too, about some Christians believing this because they're like, God can be the source of evolution. Like, he could have put it in motion. And I've also seen, like, that the days of creation aren't necessarily just a day. And that's the hard thing for me is, like, some Christians want to say, okay, you can't, some of the Bible is figurative, so it's kind of, don't know. Yeah. But then there are other Christians who are like, no, everything is exactly as it says. But then you ask those people, okay, well, what about this? Like, is this saying exactly, like, did this man see a lion's head with a snake's tail, sort of, like, was this actually what they saw? And they're like, oh, no, it's figurative for, like, the different aspects of God, or, something like that. So it's like, okay, so you pick and choose what you want to be figurative and what you want to be literal. So there's kind of that, like, okay, if we are saying that the days of creation can be figurative, then why couldn't some of that, and I'm not saying, I don't know, I'm also still working on what I believe, and I think me and you have discussed this. Like, we're just constantly searching for what we think is the truth. Was it an actual day? Was it a long time? Because I was even reading how like some people on the outside of the church, they look at it and they see contradictions.
Well, and I think too, a part of it, is on the first day there will be this, boom, that happens. Could leave it for a century, come back. Then the second day, boom, this, leave it for another century, come back. It's like nowhere does it say it's 7 consecutive days.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it could be like the first day I worked on this and then I left it and I let it happen. And then the second day I did this and then I left it and I let it happen. It could very well be that. We don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it is we don't know. We can't say for sure. That's it. That's why it's faith. Again, going back to that, like it's,
right.
You can't say that's where this is what I'm choosing to believe in. So
right.
I'm just going to have faith that this is correct.
Right.
But going back to the Wes, that it's the word of God written by men. That's something
we've talked about.
Not only
so
we
much.
literally talked about this like 2 days ago. Not only is it written by men, but it's also translated by men. Mm-hmm. And we learned in one of our college courses, there's 3 different words for the word love. There's 3 different types of love in the Greek language? Yeah. And all 3 of those are used in the Bible. All 3 different terms are used in the Bible. So it's like, who's to say some of this isn't getting translated incorrectly? Like it's getting misconstrued in translation, and that's even part of it.
Even like the King James version, like that was actually added to. And like people don't realize that like that some of the more modern translations are actually trying to go back to the original, and I believe the King James version uses the word unicorn. And if you ask any Christian today, I highly doubt they're going to be like, yeah, unicorns are real.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay.
I mean, they could be. It could be.
They could be. You don't know. And that's what I'm saying. Like, yes, the Christian community uses, I don't know if you've heard this one too, but like we have more copies of the Bible than like the Iliad, and we have like more copies of certain manuscripts than this and this. But we believe that the Iliad is a accurate translation, and supposedly the Bible is like 99% accurate, whereas the Iliad's 95%, which is not much difference to me. But they're trying to make the point like the translation is actually accurate. I'm like, okay, but like you said before, this was written by man. So maybe the translation could be accurate, but how do we know that what they were being told supposedly by God, how do we know that
they interpreted it correctly? Yeah. And also, how do we know that they chose the correct books to go in the Bible? Because there are books that were left out of the Bible.
Do you want to comment on that, Wes?
Yeah, there are a lot of books. That's one thing I was kind of like with the Bible is with Catholicism and like in the Vatican archives, like there are books of the Bible or chapters in the Bible that aren't included, but also just in Christianity as a whole, I know there are a lot of chapters that aren't included. There's the lost books of the Bible from the Apostolic Fathers, the forgotten books of Eden,
the Maccabees, the Book of the Maccabees. I read one that was called Bel and the Dragon, and it was pretty much a Daniel story, but it was like just a slightly different. Like they worshipped a different god, and it was like a different story, but then he also got thrown in the lion's den. So I'm like, I know that they include certain ones because they think it's more, I guess, historically accurate, but I'm like, the Bible, lots of times people don't focus on the history of the Bible as much as like what it's saying to us, I feel like. I mean, people do, because that's how they discount it to be true or whatever, but if you're like just talking about how God rescued him from the lion's den, then like why did this story go in and not this one? You know what I mean? Like
exactly. It's like who, like how, and I understand that they were like guided by God during it, but it's like, how can you know? Because we don't know those people. We don't know their walk. We just have to trust it. And again, that goes back to the faith of like God made sure everything that was supposed to be in the Bible was put in the Bible. But there's also different, like you were saying, different versions of the Bible. So it's like, how do we know which one's right? You know, like there's different religions that have like, that are very close to ours that just have like a couple different things in it where it's like, how do we know that's not the correct one? Kind of a thing, you know?
And ultimately, like, we don't speak Greek and we don't speak Hebrew. So how do we know? There are words that don't even exist in the English language to convey this. Just like,
they don't even translate.
They don't even translate. So I think you had some other comments about that as far as like the excuse about like justice and God in the Bible.
God is claimed to be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving. But there's also like, I don't know if the correct word is vengeful side of God or like the hand of justice, but there are certain things that I just like moral wise don't know if I agree with. And some examples are like, so the belief is if you do not give your life over to Christ or you aren't a Christian, you don't go to heaven, right? You go to hell.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there are plenty of cases where unfortunately, children of miscarriage, young ones dying or anything like that. So do they just get, tossed in the pit?
What I was taught was there's like a certain age where you're like aware of what is good, what is bad. A baby in a womb doesn't know what is good, what is bad yet. A newborn baby doesn't know what is good, what is bad yet. Like that's what I was taught. At least it's very much. There's like an age of like
accountability, they call it.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
But then I'm like, if that's the case, then they still go to heaven without believing in Christ. So isn't that kind of contradict? Not like,
but they don't believe. Like it's not like
they can't believe anything.
They can't. It's not like they don't believe in Christ and they believe this instead. I think is
and it's just like, what is that age? Because everyone's different.
Everyone is different.
Well, another like argument kind of on the same premise that I've seen is like, there's still tribes of people who are completely shut off from civilization, society, anything like that. And as much as, people try to evangelize, there are some people who like, they just never get the chance to be outreached and they never get the chance to be introduced to the Word of God. Not of their own choice. Is that mean they go to hell?
I mean, that's a good point. I feel like we can't know.
Right.
We can't know, I do feel like, and this may be controversial, but I feel like a lot of times humans overcomplicate the who goes to heaven, who goes to hell. It's like, if you've accepted Christ into your heart, that's it. There you go. There it is. But then also, if you're not introduced to Christ, who's to say that God isn't understanding and being like, you accepted of the version of me that you knew. You weren't taught about me. So you accepted the version of me that you knew. Who's to say he's not going to accept them as well? Because just because they weren't taught about him doesn't mean they should be punished,
That's what I'm saying. Like all these other religions that have a creator God, who's not to say that that's their
version.
That's their understanding.
Yeah.
Of what they think is out there.
If they were,
I'm not
if
trying
they
to
weren't taught any better,
to
no, yeah, no.
Well, which I don't even know if it is sacrilegious. Because,
Yeah. But it's like if they weren't taught any better, God, like I feel like it's God's judgment. Yeah. It's not ours.
We become judges when we're not.
When we're not supposed to. Yeah. Which going
Judge,
back,
jury, and executioner.
Yeah. But that's not us. That's not our job. That's God's job.
Amen.
So I mean, like you can't.
It's just like you keep going. You can't know. Felina's agnostic.
No. Now.
Well, that's a good point. This is probably something better that I should have said up in the beginning, but like my goal for saying all of this is not to sway one people one or another. Honestly, my goal is to not have a goal, because like I think the more productive debates are the ones where you're not trying to prove the other people wrong,
right,
or trying to like attack the belief, but more of like, this is why I'm coming for where I'm coming from. Take from this information as you will, and hopefully like use it. You can use it to better your own belief. You can use it to do whatever you want with. I think beliefs become stronger when you're willing to look at the opposite opinion as well.
Yeah.
When you can look into it and be like, you know what? No, I believe what I believe. You know, like,
Right.
but at least you looked into it and you know that's not what you're gonna. I have a friend who says subscribe to, you know, like
It's actually healthier to be exposed more to these things and be able to be like,
stand strong.
yeah, and actually be like, you know what? I'm going to study this and I'm going to have these conversations because I think that they help me think about life and they help me actually think about my beliefs and strengthen them. Because if you just go believing what someone else taught you, then the moment you hear something different, that's when your faith is going to be shaken because you have not studied for yourself. And I've seen so many people in my past do this who were raised in very conservative, like strict homes that like the moment they got out, it just was like 180. You know what I mean? It was just like, I'm going to abandon everything. And that's also not like,
because they weren't taught anything else. They didn't know anything else.
And then they start hearing all these things and they're like, what the heck have I been taught my whole life? Like I've been sheltered in such a way that I don't even know that these things exist. And I'm not saying that if that's the right decision for them, that's the right decision. But I think doing it that fast can be dangerous. Like with you, you know, you had that slow process. Like with Rhett and Link, they had that slow process because like this is things that you believe your whole life and then you just completely turn away from it. It's going to cause you to, I mean, maybe that's effective for some people. Maybe they just need the cutoff, but I think that it doesn't let them time to think about what's really happening as they're deconstructing.
Well, and I think another point of it is too, in this season of their life, they're walking away. They're deconstructing, you know, they're just not having anything to do with it. And then it could be later they do pick it up and they start researching and then they find out what they want to believe.
That's
or
true.
It could
That's
not
true.
be, you know, but it's kind of like what you were saying, the rebellion, the woke, like sometimes you need to go through that before you can
That's true.
actually look into it,
Yeah.
you know?
And I think that's an important point. Like, I think everyone deserves the right to like change their minds as much as they want. Like, just as much as like I feel like I'm agnostic now. I don't know. I could have.
You could change your mind 2 years from now, you know?
I could
like,
become a monk somewhere 2 years from now.
I don't
Goodbye,
think Hannah
Hannah.
would want that.
Yeah, doesn't that mean that you like can't be married?
Wouldn't you
Yeah.
have to get a divorce? Well, no, because you couldn't be a monk if you were divorced, right?
I don't know.
Isn't that a thing?
Hannah would just have to go, quote unquote, missing.
Oh.
Well, you heard it here, folks.
yeah.
If Hannah goes missing in 2 years,
Last week or the week with coffee, I joked about divorcing Wes, and now
Missing.
he's talking about me
he's
being
talking
missing.
about you going missing.
What else?
Maybe you guys might need to talk to somebody.
We might need to go to some counseling. What else did you have that you wanted to talk about, or is that kind of?
I mean, that's really like the heart of it, and too, because like one thing like I was gonna bring up, I didn't want to come in here seeming like I was attacking Christians or anything like that. And I think one of the biggest things is like to be able to admit when you're wrong, and that's for no matter what side you're on, what you believe. Because like when doing some research for coming in here, one thing I was going to be like is, you know, I bet there's a big connection with like the belief in Christianity and like depression, suicide rates, anything like that. But like all the research I found is like Christianity is like a pretty good protective factor for these kinds of things. They have lower rates of depression and lower rates of suicide. The only thing I found was like they do tend to have a higher sense of anxiety, which Hannah knows all about.
Hey, I do.
But like that's one thing we do. Like one thing, a part of my job too, is when I'm working with kids and we have like a risk assessment we do, there's a list of protective factors that can lower their score, and one of them is like religious beliefs and involvement in religious activities. So I do think like no matter where, there's always going to be positives and there's always going to be negatives. That's kind of just a part of life.
Yeah, kind of like what role does religion play in the world? Like, is it beneficial, or do you think that we're trying to just explain what's going on in the world?
I think it's just, I mean, this is kind of what being agnostic is like, we want answers, but we can't, like, how are we going to know what that answer is? So, you know, things get broken up into different groups, the Christians, Catholics, Mormons. Who's to say who's right, who has it wrong? We can't know. And with that, we bow our heads in prayer.
He's got jokes.
He's got the jokes.
That's funny.
Well, Wes, thanks for sharing your beliefs with us today and your thoughts and insights. And just so everyone knows, this is kind of like an ongoing journey, I think, for all of us. And that's kind of what I've really been focusing on. Like, it's okay for it to be
A journey. You don't have to just believe it because your parents said,
yeah,
we believe it. You're going to come with us to church. It
Yeah.
should be your own faith.
Yep. So like and subscribe on Spotify.
And again, don't hesitate to reach out to us at lattespodcast@gmail.com or on our Instagram page at Lattes on My Mind. All lowercase, all one word.
And maybe next week we'll get back to conspiracies. Who knows?
Maybe, who knows? Maybe this will just be a religion month. We might, I don't know.
From Christianity to conspiracies.
Woo-hoo.